everybody. Thank you for coming today. First, I'd like to thank Rosa Silvio for inviting me. When she contacted me, I was like, yes, of course I want to come to Dixon, except if God is after the new year, because I'm so overwhelmed right now. So, I'm nice and calm. I'm on sabbatical right now. And so, you have my full attention, or I have your first I'd like to acknowledge all the ancestors in this space. This is a very sacred and special place. Those of you who are from here and who grew up here, and those of you who now call El Dique home, it's a great pleasure for me to be among the ancestors and the spirits of this really sacred space. And also, I just want to recognize Stanley Crawford, one of our knowledge keepers who passed earlier this week. And those of you who knew him and loved him and loved his work, I mean, he was such a forerunner in recording and preserving the history of Nuevo Mexico. Right? So with that, I'm born and raised in the Puaque Valley, and I now live in Los Lunas, which is my partner's hometown of many generations with our kids. And so, every community that we travel through in and through New Mexico, there's so many connections. I was telling Rosa earlier, she was like, I have family in Vegas, and I was like, who's your family in Vegas? Because my family's from Vegas. So we're all familia here, and in that spirit, we can keep Resolana in this very special library space that has so much history. Esteban's work was so important to my own work, and I remember when we had the first New Mexico History Conference, so that was in 2008, I think it was, I don't even remember what year, and I remember Esteban and I sat there and had a real important conversation, and I started teaching the bioregionalism essay where he mentions Los Alamos, and that was like almost 20 years ago now. So, Esteban, Presente, you are so important to my work and important to this book, and you see Esteban in this book. So what I think I want to do today, given where we are, and given the crowd, the audience here, I'm going to do a little bit of reading from the introduction, and then we'll just open it up to Plática, and I hope that's okay with everyone. On June 20th, 2008, my family and I gathered for my cousin Ricky's funeral. Our large family occupied 10 pews in Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe Church in Pojoaque, New Mexico. Ricky, the second oldest of 15 grandchildren, left behind a wife and 2 daughters. He was a lifelong employee at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, where he was the victim of at least one nuclear spill that exposed him to radiation. Afterward, he suffered multiple organ failure over the course of 10 years. We buried him exactly 1 month before his 42nd birthday. When he was dying, Ricky revealed to our family that after one exposure incident, he had walked into the Los Alamos grocery store after work. The grocery store was shut down and decontaminated after his passage, yet no one came to Ricky's house or our neighboring houses to check on our potential exposure with Geiger counters after Ricky came home. His obituary says that he died from an undisclosed illness, and the cause of death on his death certificate reads unknown. But we know what killed Ricky, Los Alamos. My cousin Ricky was not the first member of our family whose life was claimed by the lab, as Northern New Mexicans call it. On December 23rd, 1977, my family buried my paternal grandfather, Ramon Gomez Sr., 8 years before I was born. My grandpa and 3 of his 4 brothers, Pedro Ramon, Tobias, and Jose Margarito, all worked in Los Alamos at various times. Those 4 brothers died of cancer. My grandpa cleaned the tools that were used on plutonium and uranium. He died of colon cancer at age 73. Their sister, María Feliz, never worked at the lab. She lived to be 92 years old. Grandpa Gomez passed away 3 decades before his grandson, Ricky. Both died because of their jobs at Los Alamos. I grew up in El Rancho, New Mexico, a rural community in the Pojoaque Valley. El Rancho exists within the traditional homelands of the Tewa-speaking peoples of Powogue Owinge, known more widely by its colonial name of San Ildefonso Pueblo. Every Sunday morning, my family and I attended Catholic Mass inside the Pueblo. Every feast day, January 23rd, we shared a meal at my grandmother's house, and we attended Vísperas at the Pueblo the evening before. It's an Indo-Hispano community by definition and in practice, and it is also a community overshadowed by the Los Alamos National Laboratory. The lab has brought much pain to its residents of the Pojoaque Valley, including those who worked on the hill where the lab is located. In the 1940s, military and scientific personnel chose the Pajarito Plateau to site Project Y or Site Y of the secret Manhattan Project, where scientists would develop the atomic bomb. My grandmother's family and other Nuevomexicanos and Tewa people were forcibly dispossessed of their ranches and sacred land on the Pajarito Plateau with inequitable or no compensation. Beginning in the 1940s, lab personnel directed Valley vecinos to bury contaminated everything in the Los Alamos Canyon and nearby along the Rio Grande. The soil and the water that Nuevomexicanos once used to irrigate crops is now polluted with toxic chemicals and remnants of nuclear materials. Cancer, thyroid disease, and unexplained organ failure, among other illnesses, now plague our community. Nuclear colonialism began in New Mexico, where the nuclear weapons complex began. If Spanish colonialism brought Spanish colonizers and US colonialism brought American colonizers, then nuclear colonialism brought nuclear colonizers, scientists, military personnel, atomic bomb testing, and nuclear waste among them. This book exposes nuclear colonialism as both the third major settler colonial period in New Mexico and as an ism, that is, a form of doctrine, theory, or practice having or claiming to have a distinctive character or relation. Rhetorician Danielle Andres defines nuclear colonialism as, quote, a system of domination through which governments and corporations disproportionately target and devastate indigenous peoples and their lands to maintain the nuclear production process, end quote. I would add to this definition what Patrick Wolf says about settler colonialism, quote, the colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event, end quote. In their essay, Rethinking Settler Colonialism, Rosaura Sanchez and Beatriz Pita define colonization as a, quote, state-sponsored settlement, end quote, and follow Wolf's rationale that settler colonialism is a form of colonialism in which the colonists displace or eliminate the natives wholesale. Nuclear colonialism and settler colonialism share many of the same characteristics, but there is one major distinction. Nuclear colonialism is a neo-colonial framework that targets not only indigenous people, but also other ethnic minority groups in poor economic situations that have become disenfranchised because of state occupation of their homelands. Today, the nuclear industrial complex pervades New Mexico. What began as the nuclear weapons complex under the Manhattan Project has expanded into the commercial nuclear energy industry, and New Mexico is now a cradle-to-grave nuclear industrial complex, where everything from uranium mining to nuclear waste repositories occupies this place. A tacit geographic binary shapes the cultural borderlands region of Los Alamos, New Mexico. It is a place of boundaries and borders. After passing the last Nuevomexicano community in the Pojoaque Valley, El Rancho, you enter San Ildefonso Indian Reservation. A sign notifies you of your entrance onto sovereign Pueblo land. You approach the Rio Grande where the abandoned railroad tracks once served the Chile Line Railway. A crumbling adobe house is all that remains where Edith Warner once lived and served as the unofficial gatekeeper to Los Alamos. You cross the Rio Grande over a 4-lane bridge, but off to the side you see the original suspension bridge. You pass the turn off to Capo Wingue, Santa Clara Pueblo, and the Española Valley on your right. From there you must choose between two roads. The main ascent up the hill follows a winding road that locals used to call El Camino de la Culebra, and ends in the small modern-day city proper, which developed around the scientific laboratory. The truck route takes you directly to technical areas at the Los Alamos National Laboratory. In 1942, the government ordered the construction of a perimeter fence around the then secret Site Y of the Manhattan Project. Consequently, they established an explicit border to distinguish the scientists and army personnel within the fence atop the hill as insiders, and the communities outside the fence below the hill as outsiders. As a result of the distinction between the hill and the valley, Los Alamos has become what Chicana theorist Gloria Anzaldúa writes of the borderlands region of South Texas, a, quote, place of contradictions where hatred, anger, and exploitation are the prominent features of this landscape, end quote. The hill-valley binary is not simply geographic. Chicano literary scholar José David Saldivar says of topospatial readings such as this one that, quote, "The aim of these topospatial readings, it bears some repeating, is to show the profound interactions of space and history, geography and psychology, nationhood and imperialism, and to define space as not just a setting, but as a formative presence throughout," end quote. The US military deliberately constructed this institution, and it continues to overshadow northern New Mexico 75 years after the Manhattan Project was instituted on the Pajarito Plateau. The dichotomizing of the hill and the valley made objects of the people of New Mexico by enticing them away from land-based lifestyles with well-paying jobs in the nuclear industry, jobs that ultimately sickened, injured, and even killed them by contamination or explosion. In the chapter Entering into the Serpent from Borderlands La Frontera, the New Mestiza, Ansaldúa claims that, quote, "In trying to become objective, Western culture made objects of things and people when it distanced itself from them, thereby losing touch with them. This dichotomy is the root of all violence," end quote. Nuevomexicanos' ascent up El Camino de la Culebra, the Snake Road, is a literal entering into the Ansalduan serpent. The entering into the serpent is the catalyst for conocimiento, or a coming to consciousness. Through recalling stories by Nuevomexicanos who lived, and worked under the boot of the nuclear weapons complex, I established how New Mexicans developed a nuclear facultad. Ansaldúa defines la facultad as the capacity to see in surface phenomena the meaning of deeper realities, to see the deep structure below the surface. It is an instant sensing, a quick perception arrived at without conscious reasoning. It is an acute awareness mediated by the part of the psyche that does not speak, that communicates in images and symbols which are the faces of feelings, that is, behind which feelings reside out. The one possessing this sensitivity is excruciatingly alive in the world. In this book, I convey how and why the government, the military, the laboratory, and private companies have exploited Nuevomexicanos beginning in 1942. The how focuses on how the federal government expanded the economy and created, quote, "good jobs" within the nuclear industrial complex. The why addresses race, ethnicity, class, gender, and resistance. Ansaldúa claims that, quote, "confronting anything that tears the fabric of our everyday mode of consciousness and that thrusts us into a less literal and more psychic sense of reality increases awareness and la facultad," end quote. When the US government dichotomized the hill and the valley, the process generally forced Nuevomexicanos away from the land where they farmed, ranched, and remained in tune with the earth, and where indigenous people maintained ancestral sites. Their connections to the earth as farmers and ranchers were replaced by industrial jobs at the lab. Over 75 years of having the fabric of your consciousness ripped repeatedly by nuclear colonialism through lies and neglect, many Nuevomexicanos have developed this sixth sense. In fact, it is more than a sense. The locals know their land, their local land and water supplies are contaminated from the nuclear material that was either buried in nearby canyons or on riverbanks. They know their presence on the Pajarito Plateau is being erased from national memory. They know they were placed in dangerous jobs because of their identities. They know the plutonium exploded into the atmosphere during the Trinity test is making them sick. They know nuclear waste, if buried in their backyard, poses severe threats. This sensing, or rather innate knowing, has resulted in many Nuevomexicanos speaking out against the nuclear industrial complex and demanding justice. Thus, this book argues that disease and death caused by the nuclear industrial complex throughout New Mexico have brought to light nuclear colonialism. Many scientists, scholars, and former residents have told the story of Los Alamos, focusing primarily on the hill, drawing attention to the history of American exceptionalism that the nationalist Los Alamos story promotes. They have authored a history of Los Alamos that represents only one side of the barbed wire, marginalizing voices of indigenous people and Nuevomexicanos who were displaced from their ancestral homelands and their homes and ranches on the hill, who took pride in their work in Los Alamos during the early years of the Manhattan Project, and who continue to be the majority of the labor force today at the present institution. This selective sampling of stories can be understood within what New Mexico literary scholar Patricia Marina Trujillo considers literary gentrification, which she defines as, quote, "a process invested in the restructuring of literary spaces for use by hegemonic institutions for the means of educating, representing identities of, and entertaining a reader about a space for middle-class consumers, end quote. I would add to that definition that the stories written about Los Alamos and the development of nuclear industries in New Mexico are also written for a white audience. Nuclear Nuevo Mexico began as a mapping of inchoate narratives to contribute to decolonizing the modern account of New Mexico in atomic history and US national myth. My original intent was to recover the voices of the men and women who were displaced and effaced by the scientific empire known today as the Los Alamos National Laboratory. My investigation has since evolved to examine the nuclear industrial complex throughout New Mexico, beginning with Site Y of the Manhattan Project. While I was reading other studies on nuclearism and nuclear colonialism, I realized a major lacuna exists. Nuevomexicanos were being ignored as a major and a minority population that has been significantly targeted by nuclear colonialism. While many studies rightly call attention to the effects of nuclear industries on indigenous populations, adjacent Spanish-speaking populations and their descendants have been omitted from these discussions. In New Mexico, where nuclearism began and where nuclear colonialism is the third major colonial period, Nuevomexicanos are the population of Spanish-speaking New Mexicans and their descendants who acknowledge both their Spanish and indigenous lineage, and who rejected the term Mexican-American after the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. This nomenclature is especially used in northern and central New Mexico, although we also find it used in the southern part of the state among Hispanic and Mexican-American populations. The term refers to an identity more than an ethnicity, what Erlinda Gonzalez Berry and David Maciel call a people who for centuries have occupied a particular region, which they have come to see as their homeland, albeit a contested one. Like Gonzalez Berry and Maciel, I also find this term to best identify a culture and a people whose roots reach deep into the brown earth of their homeland and across its cultural borderlands. As a regional identity, Nuevomexicanos are connected to New Mexico through cultural customs, including agriculture, food, religion, language, and other practices. Reclaiming home. I began this project years ago because I was homesick. I was homesick for the ranch in Los Alamos that I never knew. I was homesick for the grandfather who died of cancer before I could meet him. I was homesick for the Nuevomexicano ancestral space in Los Alamos from which Nuevomexicanos and indigenous peoples have been alienated. We were forced to grow up in an atomic third space, a space that exists between the bomb and the bean fields, between the atomic city and the Nuevomexicano Valley. I too am also afraid of going home. At least I was afraid, until I began to see that Los Alamos was not the only region affected by the US nuclear project. I began to realize that New Mexico, from corner to corner and everywhere in between, has been shaped and misshaped by nuclear colonialism. At first, people in my community were apprehensive to talk about the lab because you don't bite the hand that feeds you, the knife that butters your bread, know what I mean? As one vecino told me in 2012. I persisted, and eventually I found the people who were unafraid to talk about how the lab had harmed them. After I committed to investigating subaltern histories of Los Alamos, I was amazed at how the elders in my community began to share their stories with me. Had no one ever asked them about their experiences before? I located interviews white scholars had conducted, but such interviews focused on who the elders knew and for whom they had worked, the Oppenheimers, the Tellers, the Fermis. The researchers were not actually interested in the experiences of Nuevomexicanos themselves. The viejitos were interesting to these white researchers only by association. In one interview I found, my great aunt, who passed away in 2016, discusses how her employer brought her a fur coat from a trip to New York. That was the highlight of the interview. Quite differently, in my conversations with Nuevomexicano elders, they talked to me about where they had worked and the work they accomplished. I quickly learned that Nuevomexicanos were proud of their contributions to the Manhattan Project and seemed to recognize that the lab now serves as an irreplaceable economy for northern New Mexico. But does that mean we cannot challenge this problematic institution? Have Nuevomexicanos become compliant in the scandalous efforts of the lab, or the mining, the transuranic dump, or the nuclear tourism that have evolved since 1945? Have we been implicitly enjoying the benefits of the nuclear empire since the days of the Manhattan Project? As I began to probe this phenomenon, many things came to light. The first lesson was when I realized that northern New Mexico and the communities surrounding Los Alamos are not the only ones to be affected by nuclear colonialism. Indigenous communities outside of the vicinity of Los Alamos have been ravaged by the uranium mining and milling industry. Other Nuevomexicano communities were targeted for atomic testing, and others are being targeted for nuclear waste repositories. This is to say that other Nuevomexicano communities are being affected. The second lesson came when I concluded that, despite what many people argue, New Mexico is not a national sacrifice zone. In order to be a sacrifice zone, the object being sacrificed has to hold value. New Mexico does not hold value to the nation other than being a wasteland. This is where the impetus for focusing on Nuevo Mexico came in. Nuevo Mexico is not just the Spanish language term for New Mexico because my focus is on heritage Spanish-speaking communities. Titling this monograph Nuclear Nuevo Mexico calls attention to the history of settler colonialism in these indigenous homelands, a history in which the ancestors of Nuevomexicanos are simultaneously colonized and colonizers. Renaming the territory first to New Spain, La Nueva España, and later to New Mexico, La Nueva Mexico, reflects two major colonial periods. Similar to what historian Myrriah Gomez attests, that colonialism was central to the origin of Mexican Americans. I contend that New Mexico was central to the origins of nuclear colonialism. New Mexico was not sacrificed. It was and continues to be a nuclear colony and the nuclear option for the country. So I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you. And we can just have a conversation, questions or comments. You know, one of the great things about, the book came out in November of 2022, and as I've been around New Mexico, engaging in pláticas like this, for me it hasn't been the questions that I fielded that have been the most significant. It's been the comments from the community. It's been the side conversations afterward. Everybody has a connection, and here we are, right? So, yeah.
Well, I just want you to know that I'm a descendant of those families that were booted out of home.
What family was it?
The Adolfo Garcia family.
Okay. So Adolfo Garcia's ranch was very close to my great-grandparents' ranch.
Was it?
We were the Cernas. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
I just want to say thank you for telling me the story and for bringing that to us here. Not so often does northern New Mexico have the ability to tell its own story, and it means a lot to hear a northern New Mexican tell the story of our experience with Los Alamos. Though a lot of our people have garnered a great deal of wealth from their experience at Los Alamos, most of us have been negatively impacted by it. And I always tell people, in northern New Mexico, you kind of just have a few pathways, like either you work at the labs, or you join the military, or you work a dead-end job in Taos or Espanola, or you stay an addict, or you farm. And farming is no longer one of those options, and you detailed it very clearly how the nuclear Lifeway has replaced our farming capacities in our community, contaminated our lands and waters and whatnot. Bringing that story from our perspective is a really, really important element to the documentation of our histories that we know has been destroyed or desecrated, dismantled. We don't know who we are, and being able to have authored, published books that does say we do acknowledge our indigenous inheritance, our ancestral lineages too. There's still a lot that this group has to violently extract from our community. But all in all, thank you. You're amazing. I have so much respect for you. I'm a super fan. And
I have so much respect for you. What's funny is you're doing the exact thing that I wish I could be doing.
For the same calling, right? That desire for home, that wish for home.
It's that herencia that, that Esteban so widely talked about, that so many of us try to hang on to, right? And it's always a coming home. Like, anytime community can get together and share knowledge, whether it's 2 people or whether it's 20 people, right? And I appreciate those comments for so many different reasons. I think that, one thing that I've always been saying for the last, how long, Robin and Janet know, I've been talking about my book for I don't know how many years until it finally, it's collective work that so many people have done. Everybody has their own stories. So it's like when this came out, I was like, this is, a version. This isn't even as the book that I wanted to write. I still have so much to write, but we all have the stories to tell. And I think that so often we've been silenced in our own telling, like you mentioned, in our own tellings of these stories, and others have wanted to and have told the stories for us, and they're not told the same ways, right? And in some ways we end up silenced, however those turn out, right? Or people, the thing that I've always said is, this isn't just I'm a professor, I'm a researcher, whatever. I can't write this book and then just bounce out to my university job somewhere. This is home, and I continue to do this work. My family continues to, my family still lives in the Poake Valley, and every time I hear about somebody new getting sick or somebody who's died of cancer, and it's like, well, let's connect the dots here. It's hard and it's difficult, and I think you're right in terms of especially these good jobs that are always sold to us at Los Alamos, you don't need a college education. And one thing that some of you may or may not be familiar with is these pipeline programs at the smaller institutions right now, right? So Northern New Mexico College right now has a huge pipeline program for glove box workers. So they're tracking students outside of high school from Espanola, from Dixon, from Poake, from all of our neighboring communities and villages, and they're training them to use glove boxes, and they're sending them out there to do the very dangerous glove box work, right? And so, it's not just the military coming in and recruiting, soldiers out of the high schools or out of the college, community, or not community colleges, but small colleges. It's also the lab and the nuclear industrial complex and the federal government in that way.
What advice would you give to youth that want to, excuse me, pick up writing about this or getting involved in nuclear industrial complex and Los Alamos in general?
Yeah, I think, there's so many, my mind just jumped to so many different things. I think one of the most powerful ways that youth can be doing right now, and depends on the age, right? But I think, and that's not just youth, everyone can be talking to their elders right now, recording stories. One of the things with this generation, as we're losing so many, something's shifted this year in the last 12 months or so, and I'm sure you all have noticed this, right? I was in Poake back in, I don't know, I guess it was November, reading the eulogy for my dad's prima hermana who had worked in Los Alamos, and the family had asked me to read the eulogy. And when I looked around, here's all of these elders and so many who have passed away, even from this community in the last week, a few months, right? Look in the last couple weeks, we've lost Scott Mamade, we've lost Stan, we've lost John Nichols, right? And so we need to be
Sandoval.
Yeah, there's another one. So something's shifting majorly right now, and so we really need to be recording these stories of the elders in their own words. And one of the things that I have always, as I've done this work, that I've always said is let them speak for themselves, right? We don't need to be doing some interpretation and some fancy analysis of their words. Let them speak. That's what Jose Luis is saying, right? Let them speak for themselves. So that's one thing, right? The other thing is that, as the daughter of 2 public educators, both of my sisters are public educators. One sister works as a teacher for Poake Valley schools. One sister is the librarian for West Las Vegas public schools, elementary schools. And as an educator myself, I know that college is not the right path for everyone, right? but we can be doing other things in our communities to be reclaiming these traditions and preserving these traditions that are just as important, right? I think that what the lab has done, and Esteban was the most brilliant one to write about this, is it shifted us into, we totally skipped the industrial age. We went from a totally agrarian, right? And the impact of that, of like skipping and not really going slowly through that, of skipping that kind of process, like really like set us off balance, right? And so all these youth think that they need to go get this like very well-paying job. We're just stuck in this capitalist society, right? And so for the youth, libraries are so fundamentally important to creating programs that youth can get involved in, for knowledge preservation, cultural preservation, and just setting up interviews. One of the things that I've seen libraries do recently, we were just working on a grant application to continue. We started this, myself and another professor who grew up in Los Alamos, actually. Her name is Ana Noga. I don't know if anybody's familiar with her. She works in the Spanish department at UNM. And we've been working on this Nuevomexicano baby boomers oral history project for the last, 5-ish years, pre-COVID, and then COVID kind of slowed us down. So we're doing a second phase. We had 36 UNM students interview Nuevomexicano baby boomers. And that generation is so important, right? And they never get talked about. And in New Mexico, that's the generation that started working at the lab. And that's the generation that had the Spanish, just like, whether it was beat out of them or they just didn't learn Spanish because their parents had it beat out of them. It's such a critical generation to be thinking about and talking to. But what I was saying is I was on the Boston City Library website a couple days ago. They have these oral history backpacks that they check out. So it has like a recorder, or I don't think it had a camera, but I think it was like a voice recorder, a fancy one, and instructions, and the youth can check them out. Those are the kinds of things that that we can be encouraging the youth to do.
El oro del barrio.
El oro del barrio, right? There's another Dixon native, right, who taught us about cultivating and finding and digging and talk about extraction, right? But the different type of extraction, el oro del barrio, right? And holding these resolanas as a way to preserve the tradition. Did you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I was, the focus on the stories and what has happened. Is there any focus on the safety of the workers that are involved now? Is there, I read the story in Searchlight, which...
Alicia.
Was it Alicia?
Alicia wrote it, yeah. Everybody confuses us, and I'm like, cool, I'll take it.
About the 90-year-old lady that... Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, with the whole family that also contracted cancer, all her family. And they felt, Alicia felt that it was him bringing home with him his contamination. And so is there any ongoing safety measures for these homes? I mean, is there checking background?
So first I'll say that Alicia and I are friends, and the work that she's doing, if you're not familiar with it, just go look at Search New Mexico and read the stories that she's been doing. She's been working on she hopefully wins like a Pulitzer for this series, right? What she's doing. But the story that she most recently wrote and published in Searchlight about what they're calling Truchas women, right? And we've always known about Truchas women, or heard, I guess, kind of in the underground about Truchas women. And she went and dug up records, and we know that there are so many people similar to that were contaminated. Los Alamos kept those files, right? They did all these autopsies. Alicia and I are actually we just started a project together this week. I won't say much more about it, but that'll be in the future, I guess. And I think that, the records are so deep. But again, like, if we're talking about the past, maybe the records are there, maybe they're not. Maybe we can do this type of work that she and I are doing, but what's happening now? So we know that workers have their dissymmetry badges, right? We know that after Cerro Grande, Jose Luis and I were talking about this earlier, like after Cerro Grande, there was a really interesting jump in in the way we started talking about and thinking about how contamination was being brought home, right? Because of the ways that especially the firefighters were bringing their clothes home, and their wife was throwing it in the laundry with the children's clothes or whatever, and it was all just getting cycled together. And I think that really picked the attention of a lot of people to be thinking and questioning the safety. So I find that to be like a major schism right now, is the people who are working in Los Alamos, but they're questioning their safety in ways that they never did before. Chapter 2 of this book, I talk about the explosions that happened in the 1950s and the men who were killed because they were blamed for not, the safety procedures didn't exist, and they were used as guinea pigs to establish safety procedures, essentially.
I just wanted to say, for me, I think what the federal government fire did was it made us all, helped us realize that we're downwind.
Right.
And when I understood nuclear contamination, we don't need a burning fire plume to indicate that we're downwind from Los Alamos. And the fire, once it's put out, doesn't mean the radiation that's contaminated the particulate matter is gone also. It's live right now in this current moment, and it has been since the creation and the use of these volatile elements, continuously been downwind contaminating us, for not just Dixon, Peñasco, Española, Pojoaque, all the way into Oklahoma. You can see that Cerro Grande plume that stayed there for months. That is the downwind path of Los Alamos.
And the interesting thing, I'm glad you brought up the plume, because the interesting thing that, now we can kind of talk about it in this way is, I've been working with over the last, 10 years, I've worked with the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium. I wrote their health impact assessment. I have a chapter on them in the book, and one of the things when we talk about the plume and the plume map that the federal government created after the Trinity test in 1945, and they said, oh, the plume just went around the reservation, the plume didn't affect New Mexico, and you guys aren't downwinders. And now we can say, look at Cerro Grande, look at, other fires, look at what happened in Mona, look where that plume went all the way across. Like, we have this technology to be able to talk about plumes like this now. And we have the knowledge, and it's like Tina always says, we're not those people anymore, right? We're not those people that they thought they were coming in and just talking down to or doing whatever they wanted to in 1945. Like, we're gonna fight, we're not gonna just lay down and take it anymore, right? I think that going back to your question, there is some research that's starting now with outside researchers who do soil sampling, who are going to be coming into communities and doing soil sampling.
Or just present day monitoring.
Right.
At one point, I think it was after one of the fires, something was set up here as to, to check levels of stuff.
Sherry Kotowski did it.
Well, I was going to say Sherry did a lot of soil sampling and water sampling here in Dixon, right?
Yeah.
The other thing that I was going to mention is the way, so we know, like, with the waste that's it's thrown in an unlined pit in Albuquerque, outside of Sandia, the mixed waste landfill, 2.5, right? 2.5 square, is it acres or miles? Miles? Oh God, I should know that off the top of my head. But anyway, they actually placed the readers in places that they weren't going to pick up the contamination. They were wrongfully placed, and so there's a group of people, including Janet, who've been working for so long to get those placed properly, adequately. The same things happening with the hexavalent chromium plume that we've been watching, right? And the contamination of our water, and not just downwind, but downstream and downriver, and thinking about how the whole water source, drinking water of the Española Valley right now is at stake with this hexavalent chromium plume. And so, it brings me to another topic that Rosa is working on and interested in, and I think there are others now, thinking about this, but this idea of nuclear literacy, and what does that mean, right? And the way I've been thinking about it is like kind of twofold. So in one way, it's teaching people from our communities, the common person, how to understand these readings, how to understand how to write comments, to DOE, to Triad, to whomever, how to become part of the process, because one of the things that I argue in this book is that, we have been victims of environmental racism. Essentially, that's what's continuing to happen, right? And one of the tenets of environmental racism, as Benjamin Chavez defines it, is that you do not have part in that process and you are left out of that process. But if we don't even know how to participate in that process, you know, I've been studying these issues, and I'm not a scientist, but I've been studying these issues, and there are so many parts of it that I still don't understand when I read reports, or, you know, and then there's putting out, how long was the WIP report, the recent one? Like, who can even understand that or read that? It was over 1,000 pages, right? So there's that aspect of nuclear literacy. And then there's this other aspect, and maybe, Rosa, we can work on something. I wanted to talk to you about it. So I'm working on the second book right now on looking at literature written by and about communities of color having to do with nuclear industrial complex. And so there's lots of literature, both fiction and nonfiction, that has to do with nuclear topics. And one of the things that I'm trying to do with this, and I have one chapter that's out, that's published already, that'll hopefully be in the bigger book, but one of the things that I'm trying to do is talk about this in ways that other folks who've written about atomic literature, nuclear literature have not done. Because what they've done when they write about this nuclear literature is they write about either nuclear anxiety, which is like that Cold War anxiety, that we're so afraid of a cold winter, nuclear war, nuclear weapons. I mean, we're literally right on the brink right now, again, right? Or so it's that anxiety, or it's kind of like that, what's the other term? It's that, you know, after the devastation, you know, like John Hershey's Hiroshima, right? Things that after the atomic bombs were used, or kind of after Chernobyl, or after 3 Mile Island. And of course we know, maybe, we should all know, that the biggest nuclear disaster in the US was not 3 Mile Island. It was, actually not, well, maybe, but Trinity, we don't talk about Trinity because the government won't even say that Trinity released exposure, right? Rio Puerco. The Rio Puerco, when the Rio Puerco was contaminated, it was the same day as the Trinity test, different year. So July 16th, 1945 was Trinity test. July 16th, 1979 was the Church Rock uranium spill. 100,000 gallons of irradiated water down the Rio Puerco, where they found traces all the way in California. So talk about downstream, right? But nobody talks about that. And so what I'm trying to do with this other nuclear literacy is talking about how people of color are writing about these other instances of how our communities continue to be affected, continue to be, right? Have been, continue to be over this 80-year history now, by the nuclear industrial complex. And there's a lot of literature out there, both fiction and nonfiction, including poetry from so many of our local authors here in New Mexico. Beata has one of the most beautiful, Beata Sosa Peña has one of the most beautiful poems that was published in one of the big reports in 2009, I think it was, I forget what year, 2010, and that was the La Hadra report.
The big, blue pool of water, Jason.
Whoa!
But that wasn't really my question. I was really interested in how you were butting up against the problem of secrecy surrounding the lab in particular, but so much of this research. Writing a book like this, I imagine you were constantly hitting a wall where you wish you had the information to amplify the oral histories about the experiences of people. And I imagine there was just like a big steel wall of secrecy that just crashed down at many points for you. So I'm interested in hearing how you grapple with access to information as you're writing this. And then I was also interested in that question of the sort of nationalist sentiments of some of your more elderly, interlocutors, the folks that you worked with, and how you wrote about that, because it sounds like it would be a challenge to both honor their sense of patriotism, but also maintain a kind of critical stance in relation to it. So I'd just love to hear more about that too.
Yeah, I'll take that one first and then go backwards. I think it's hard. I think even today, right, we know that people see their jobs in Los Alamos as economic and upward mobility for their families, for their communities. And we know that money has helped our communities, right, in different ways. Not everybody, right? If anything, it's bifurcated our communities also because of the way that some people have this upward mobility and other people don't, right? But with the elders, what was so interesting in talking with some of them, and they were just so proud of their work. And so there are a couple chapters where I acknowledged those comments, and I acknowledge how they said thank you. And I acknowledge kind of what they say and how they talk about their work. And also, it's not a but or either or, right? And also discuss how dangerous these jobs were, right? And for the families, I think that it's different when the families are talking about loved ones who they lost, because they're not having to negotiate, at the beginning of, there's a book that I name it in this book, and I won't today, but there's a book that says, for the people who sacrifice, blah, blah, blah. It's like, come on, in whose name? Go tell that to the families who didn't get bodies or body parts returned, right? And so I think that sometimes it was a little bit easier talking to family members, but I had to gain their trust first, and that was a huge part. This is part of why it took so dang long to write this book, because, if I went to try to talk to somebody who didn't know me and only saw me as this outsider, this professor, or if I wasn't, I'm not from Chimayo, right? So I am an outsider to that community. And so it took a long time of just gaining people's trust and having them read and reread and reread what I wrote before it went to publish. Now, so to answer kind of the wall of secrecy, I don't think there were so many other things that I wish I could have gotten access to, or at the point in the research where I was doing the research, there wasn't open access to materials in ways that maybe that's changed, and I like to think some of the ways that I call those out have helped change that. Or the ways that, for example, the Manhattan Project, the Voices of the Manhattan Project, Oral History Project, they did not have any stories of locals until we called that to their attention, and now they have some. And so I like to think that we helped change some of that, as difficult as that was, and me kind of being the complainer, whatever, if that's what it takes. Sometimes I think that was the biggest thing or scariest thing for me, and maybe this is both questions, is I have family and I have friends and high school friends and all these people who are like, you're talking against our livelihood by exposing some of this. And so it's not always a good thing, and there has been criticism, right? And that's fine. I'm not afraid of having those difficult conversations with people, and I think that's what makes the book interesting, right? But yeah, to say it simply, there were lots of times that I didn't get what I needed or didn't get the information, and it was because of things that people told me in archives, for example, where they told me, tell me what you're interested in and I'll tell you what I think you can use, because things were not indexed in ways that I could see what they actually had.
I'm just curious, because I remember in the early 70s, the lab sent some people over to have a public meeting at the Penasco Community Center or whatever, and they said that people, in the 50s and 40s and, who knows when, from the lab were told to just take containers of waste away and disappear them. So they came to this meeting and said, do any of your elders know where any of this was put? Does anybody else know about any of meetings like that? I mean, I just remember it, but I don't have any proof.
I hadn't heard that about a meeting in Penasco, so now I'm gonna go look into it. But I do know, so I'll tell you a really honest story, and I don't remember if I put it in the book or not, because I really had, that was the other thing, is like, do I want this to go in the book or not, because of somebody who it might out, or of somebody who might, even just the way we still get questioned about whether we're telling the truth, right? Yeah. Oh, you're just making that up, or you're just paranoid, or those kinds of things. My mom, right? and this is my whole life pretty much, would tell me that when she was working in Los Alamos as a younger person, and she used to remember her boss saying, oh, just go bury those barrels along the Rio Grande. And she has told me stories like that where she vividly remembers those conversations that were taking place in the office. And we know now they're unburying those, and I actually have a family member who was on that project, going and taking the barrels, and they would tell him, because he was a trucker, do not get out of your truck, do not roll the window down, do not light a cigarette, do not. And so, you know, but again, like a lot of that's classified, and I don't know. There's nice to see you.
I'm a big picture guy, so there is a question at the end of this, but obviously with New Mexico and nuclear, the model of colonialism is very apt and vivid, but you know, you don't have to zoom out very far, and you get like Terry Tempest's work in Nevada and Utah, or Hanford up in Washington, or Rocky Flats. But then again, if you go a bit more granular and then go national or even global, you basically almost everything you describe just sort of replicates the basic logic of environmental racism, environmental justice, and all that, and or injustice, you usually call it. Thomas Saw's work out in California, he examined dozens, hundreds of toxic or dangerous, polluting industry sightings. And found out, of course, race was a big predictor, class was almost equally as big, but the overall sort of transcendent determinant of where they placed anything that was toxic, dirty, dangerous was, on the one hand, yes, the convenience of the location or the perceived need for this location, and then the perceived ability of the people who lived there to fight back. So, so sometimes, race and identity and all that was always there, but it wasn't necessarily always paramount.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm wondering is, how do you imagine leveraging the story base and the more literary aspect of this, the beginning here, leverage that into some, hopefully, enhanced political power that could, ally with other voices elsewhere and stuff. Because, you don't have to go very far. You can drive across the Midwest and see, the evacuation of the land and the industries, and people migrated to the cities or stuck at the dollar store, all that. You've got Cancer Alley, you've got Appalachian coal mining. The same thing happens again and again and again for as long as we can remember almost. So.
Yeah, one of the things that I hope this shifts is that the way that environmental racism is written about at large across the I'll just use country for now, right? Is that it's typically focused on urban areas, and we don't hear a lot about environmental racism happening in rural areas. There's nowhere for us to go, right? And in some ways, like, people will tell, like, the downwinders, the Trinity downwinders who are in the communities very close to the Trinity test, well, why didn't you leave? Well, first of all, they had no clue, right? They never even gave them the chance to leave. But second of all, like, where are they gonna go? And I think that's the thing that makes New Mexico like an interesting case study, is that it's that querencia. Like, we are so tied to this place, we are not going to leave. And what has that meant as a result? When you think about other places across, like, you named some really specific locations and also some really important writers, right? For those of you who've never read Terry Tempest Williams' Clan of One-Breasted Women, that book was one of the catalysts for me when I was in undergrad when I read that the first time. I was like, oh my gosh, this happened here. Like, why isn't anybody talking about this, right? My grandma was probably one of the, I would assume, first people to have a mastectomy in the 1970s. She worked in the old Los Alamos County building, which was 2 blocks from the plutonium facility during the Manhattan Project, right? And we know that that old county building was contaminated. So I don't know. I don't know if I have really an answer for that question, except to say that I think that there are more people writing about environmental racism now in ways that are also, so not just like nuclear issues, but now they are also writing about nuclear issues but also like thinking about these really intersectional ways that people are affected. So like in Appalachia, race might not have been the main case, although people argue that that off-whiteness of Appalachians, that's a thing. But we have to be talking about class, and we have to be thinking about these other things. And your comment kind of reminded me of this thing that, as we're talking about settler colonialism in New Mexico and this third major period of colonialism, and we can't turn away from this phenomena of people, really being tied to Spanish colonialism here, especially in northern New Mexico, and wanting to be Spanish and having this whole history and this whole persona and this whole identity, right? And in some ways, it's akin to like this contemporary modern worker at Los Alamos turning a blind eye to the other things that are happening in the communities as a result of Los Alamos, or as a result of WIP, or as a result of, and so I think there's also something there that I haven't even begun to unravel, maybe because I was a little scared to go there this time, but like with this nuclear colonialism, like we are these new colonizers in a sense, right? We're contributing to that work that is also harming our communities, and what do we do with that? Like that dual identity and that third spaceness of that. I don't know. It's so complex. And I tell people it's not complicated. We understand what's happening. We've been living it for 8 years, but it is complex, right? You had a question?
Yeah. First, I just want to say appreciate the whole talk, and especially like how you use these like oral histories and like intuition as like legitimate, and like because I think like there's a tendency in like writing history, it's like, oh well, like we need to go to the state narrative and the official archives, and like if not, then it's like just speculation. But like to me, it's like they're not going to say certain things, and like, or they're only going to say it years later. So I think like trusting your mom or your grandma, and trusting you at that meeting, like, no, these things happen, and like we need to understand that the state lies about these things to cover themselves. So you're like actually treating that as like not just like kind of hearsay, but like history, like is super important. And I guess totally kind of unrelated, but like what do we do, like how do we like fight nuclear colonialism in New Mexico? Like how do we like fight the labs now, like and this plutonium pit production to try to ramp up?
I mean, there's so many people doing this work, and it's coalitional work, right? And there are people who've been doing this work in New Mexico longer than I've been alive, right?
Yes.
And as I was working on this book, and over the last however many years, I've met so many of these activists. Like that's why I dedicated this book to the activists. I think that the other really interesting thing here, and race comes into play, right, is because there's so many locals who see the activists or the anti-nuclear activists in New Mexico as being outsiders or being white and not being for the people. I mean, there's so much tension around that issue of race with anti-nuclear activism, and so I think that's another one of the reasons why we have so many issues and organizing around it, right? So, I want to kind of make 2 points before I lose track of what I'm saying. One is that I still think that one of the biggest things that can shift the movement right now is the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
A couple years ago, when Archbishop Wester wrote and released the pastoral letter about nuclear weapons, that was a major turning point. And last summer, after Oppenheimer came out, Archbishop Wester, myself, Tina Cordova, Jay Coughlin were on this panel together, kind of talking together, that Plowshares Fund had put together. And it was me telling the Archbishop, you can leverage this. Go into these small communities in northern New Mexico and have this little group, right? Go to St. Anthony's and have a Wednesday night conversation where you can talk to people and teach them. And then it was like, I don't know, we talked about it and then like nothing happened. And so now I'm like, I need to come back and talk to the Archbishop again. And some of us, it's not just me, other people have done it, are doing it. Jay's working really close with them. And now, of course, the Archbishop is speaking out on other things, important things right now, right? So that's kind of what I really think, and that's also tricky because indigenous communities are still very wary of the Catholic Church for good reasons, right? They are the original colonizers of this place. And so it's not like the answer to everything, but I think it can be used really powerfully. The other thing, I already lost my other point. What was I going to say? I don't know. That's a good enough one. Oh, I do know what I was going to say. Hold on, it's right at the tip of my tongue. Oh, the plutonium bits. I knew there was something else. So with pit production, it's happening really fast. So I actually brought this PowerPoint and I was like, what do I want to do? Do I want to read? Do I want to do the PowerPoint? Because I think also in terms of nuclear literacy and understanding it, so one of the things that I've been working on, and I'm hoping I can get this published soon because I have a paper written, is basically doing rhetorical analysis, so a language analysis of several documents that led up to this new pit production, and looking at ways that the documents say something like the NPR, the Nuclear Posture Review, right? Say things like, we are working toward the total elimination of nuclear weapons. That's literally the line. And then one sentence later it says, and to do that, we're gonna make new ones. And this language of deterrence is such a freaking farce, man. And so I think that, we have totally bought into it here in New Mexico because the left hand doesn't see what the right hand is doing. And if you're working, processing, property, and you're doing accounting, and you live in the valley, right, or whatever, you're not actually seeing that pit production. But on the other hand, there are physicists and we're not just the janitors anymore, right? We're in these technical positions and in these scientific positions now, people who've been here, whose families have been here since time immemorial. And so it's like, those are the people that are really difficult to have the conversations with, but they're the ones we have to be having the conversations with. So I think part of the answer to that question is we can't be afraid to have those scary conversations because they're hard and they're scary. And yeah, I don't know what else to say. So many people, both friends and family that work in Los Alamos and at Sandia, and it's like sometimes it's really hard to have those. And now that this is out, nobody wants to talk to me. So, but no, I think opening space and curriculum in the classrooms. New Mexico does not have a curriculum to adequately teach about the atomic bomb and to teach about the effects and effect of the nuclear industrial complex as it pertains specifically to New Mexico and the US. And so there are several people right now working on ways to get into the classrooms at the K-12 level.
Yeah, and so many, Los Alamos gives money, to NGOs, and probably to the library, to everywhere, and to me, I don't see that as necessarily having to be hush money, but for a lot of people, it is hush money. We get money from the lab, so
Los
we're not
Alamos
going to
Scholarship
speak.
Fund is kick me in the face because it's like, we're gonna give this brown kid a scholarship and now they're gonna be the poster child and we're gonna display their face and their name all over everything so that we can show that we're giving money back to the community, right?
Exactly. So so the Los Alamos Foundation is endowed $70 million and they give out like $2,000 here to the
we just had an interesting, I don't know how much of this I can talk about. I'll just say that there are lots of conversations happening at the nonprofit board level about the ethics of taking money from these companies and what that means and should we be taking it, and just so crazy and heated in these meetings. And oh man, I almost just walked out of this meeting a couple of months ago because it's like and then you have people advocating for it saying, well, they have to give this philanthropy money. So I don't know. I mean, do we not take the money? Do we take the money and then you use it to fight them?
Yes.
Really? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But I think the conversations are starting now, and maybe they weren't taking place before. So, Jack, please.
I was a daycare worker for many years, and when WIC was coming in, the Department of Energy gave a lot of money out to daycare centers. So a little known kind of funny fact, you know, you could get money for parties, for equipment and so on. So,
Yeah, that's so interesting. I don't know. Yeah, I didn't know that.
it's a little known fact.
They got tentacles everywhere.
Yeah, that's for sure. So maybe this is a good place to kind of end it so that everybody can have some snacks that Janet brought. Thank you. And I'm, again, just really grateful that you all were able to join today. It's great to see some familiar faces and meet some new people. And I'm easy to get in touch with. So if you ever want to get in touch, please do. And yeah, thanks.